Physical distancing has separated us at the desk. Tom, thanks for your time. It's really interesting to hear these speeches today. We have heard a very strong bipartisan push from both parties, but Labor still has some issues with this JobKeeper legislation, and we just heard their opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, said that they're not going to shy away from putting those forward for the second reading.
No, he won't. I note, Annalise, we're doing very well at social distancing because we're about 60 metres away rather than 1.5 metres, so a big tick there. Look, interesting speeches from both. Yes, on Labor, that they want to keep pushing these amendments. Crucially, what the government's been very keen to bring into this debate has been the unions, and the unions have ticked off what the government has said. Not that the ACTU, through Sally McManus, has said we've got everything we want, but they found the overall package acceptable, giving more power for bosses to drain leave for workers while paying out this JobKeeper payment, and also around redirecting their tasks and so on. Not getting casuals, as many casuals as they wanted included. Casuals are included, but only if they have a link, of course, of more than 12 months with an employer. Labor's saying they'll move these in the second reading. Essentially what that means is they'll give up on that. They assume they won't get through and they'll give up on that. Anthony Albanese, I thought, was also interesting, mentioning this is $1 trillion of debt we'll likely end up with. This will saddle a generation, and this is justification for looking at all of these changes. Even though Labor called for a wage subsidy, let's see how this all unfolds. I think that's fair enough, and we could well have this powerful committee, which, in the absence of Parliament, Annalise, will get a lot of focus. So that scrutiny, you'd think, would be fairly legitimate. From Scott Morrison there, look, really striking a lot of tones around bipartisanship. Sovereignty was also a word he used a lot there, which I thought was quite interesting, and that could well have implications down the track. Right now, for example, it means not allowing other companies to swoop in and buy businesses in Australia when they're struggling. What will that mean down the track around foreign ownership and also around our supply lines? We're finding out how vulnerable we are now to this sort of, world trade system we were so enamoured with. We had masks at one stage that were on the way to Australia that got shipped off somewhere else. We've got possibly even paracetamol, a big reliance on India there that the rest of the world has as well. So these sort of shortages we're finding out about now, that in a crisis you find out about. Yes, we're not expecting another coronavirus crisis anytime soon, but what about what happens in the South China Sea? We're living now what does happen when these supply lines are not so smooth.
And I think it is just so interesting when you see the global reaction. Every country has just retreated into its national priorities. But what's been interesting too, it's been this discussion around modelling. This was mooted for about a week that we were going to get this modelling released from the government. And they did release it yesterday. It wasn't Australia specific, and this has been a real cause of consternation for a lot of people. They want to know what the Australian data is showing. The government's been really holding off on this, saying that they just don't have enough to be able to go forward with anything that's accurate enough for Australians.
I think a lot of people, Annalise, were sort of hopeful that we'd have such good modelling and maybe even something that you could go online, check the different assumptions and almost be your own Prime Minister. You tweak the sort of restrictions and then see what happens to the economy, almost like a real-world sort of Sim City, if you like. And that didn't happen. We got a mix of, as you said there, the theoretical and then what we already know so far. So just going through some of the graphs that were released. First of all, I know there's been a big obsession. How is Australia doing compared to the rest of the world? Pretty damn well at the moment. We've probably got a little bit lucky seeing things such as Italy and China before us, but when you see this graph, you see that Australia is tracking much better, that we are managing to get that curve down right at that key point where a lot of countries sort of say, how are we tracking right now? Australia's able to say pretty well. Complacency, as we've heard from the Prime Minister, they don't want that to set in, particularly over the Easter holidays. The other one we're looking at is the uncontrolled pandemic. Now, this, if you like, is trying to show to people that are saying, why are we restricting the economy so much? Why are we doing that? Well, the key measure, the key metric for our health system is those ICU beds. You can see there under the middle element, the most likely scenario, that week 17, 35,000 ICU beds needed. Now, we're ramping up our ability right now using private hospitals to get that up to 7,500. So you can imagine what happens at 35, how many people are turned away and how many people die as a result. There wasn't a figure put on it by the government, but you're talking 100,000 plus, and that's the middle element there, the middle possibility. The other one is the one we've been talking about a lot, a phrase that's entered the national lexicon, and that is flattening the curve. This is not news here. Uncontrolled, a huge spike, the middle one with quarantine, and the last one there, a huge flattening of the curve. What's a bit harder from now for the government, I think, Annalise, is flattening the curve is great, And it gives us options now. It gives us options on how to get out of this in a health sense, but also in an economic sense. If you just flatten the curve forever and a vaccine takes 2 years, well, the economy will be in dire straits at that point. So at what point do you say, can we sort of release parts of the economy without overwhelming ICU beds? How do you factor that up against vulnerable groups? Do they end up staying at home while other people are able to be out there in the economy, getting things running again? So there are tough decisions for the government coming around those things, and just how to sort of release the handbrake a little bit.
I guess there's still that question about people don't know what their immunity would be after they've had it as well, because we do have a number of people recovering, and we've been keeping track of that data as well. But Tom, just finally, we can see restrictions based on different zones, even within states. We saw some North Queensland MPs calling for North Queensland to be blocked off. They were a bit hopeful there that they could be treated like a different state.
Yeah, they're always in some sort of North Queensland push, aren't they? Look, it is interesting because we've got some different rules around states and state borders going up, but we know the government's looked at hotspots. What about one particular area that's basically clear of COVID-19? And the Queensland Premier was saying we could have this situation of some groups having the restrictions almost lifted entirely.
The Prime Minister has said we're looking at 6 months. Let's see how we go after 6 months. But you may find that in parts of the country there are places where they are COVID-free, and there may be some mechanisms that some of those areas will be able to get back to work faster than other areas. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all approach. I think you're going to see different things in different states into the future.
And look, that makes sense. We've seen different restrictions already put up in different areas. This is looking at the other side and seeing different areas with restrictions removed. So it does give some promise to different areas that if you can be really good and disciplined, you might have some of the restrictions lifted a little bit earlier. For now, I think it's good that we've got these options, Annalise, that it is going well, but authorities hoping that continues, obviously, through the Easter holiday period.